The morning sun splashed across them all, turning the London asphalt to a river of gold. It was trooping the color, a spectacle of precision, a living painting of tradition where every thread, every boot, every salute was part of a centuries-old pattern. For Prince George, age 10, it was also a day of immense, quiet weight. Standing beside his father, Prince William, on the balcony of the Major General's office, he wore the solemn expression of a boy who understood the cameras were not just capturing his face, but measuring his future. His back was straight, his hands clasped formally before him, his blue eyes fixed on the distant field where the guards marched. He was practicing, as he had been coached, the art of being still. To be air was to be a pillar, unmoved and unmoving. A gust of wind ruffled the red plumes of the bearskins below, but George did not flinch. He was composed. He was, as the papers would later say, every inch the future king. A few feet away, a different sort of practice was underway. Prince Louis, age 5, was a live wire contained within a smart blue coat and shorts. His world was not of distant parades, but of immediate wonders. The glitter of a soldier's medal, the delightful clip-clop of horses, the fascinating way his mother's hat caught the breeze. Princess Catherine, her arm a gentle, preemptive barrier around his small frame, exchanged a fleeting, knowing look with William. It was the look of parents at a formal event with a young child, a silent prayer for peaceful passage. Louis, however, was not praying. He was investigating. He wiggled his fingers at the crowd, his face a canvas of unfiltered curiosity. The early part of the ceremony was a battle of attrition for Louis's attention, and the formalities were losing. He pointed, he whispered, he shifted from foot to foot. Each small motion was a tiny crack in the perfect facade of the day, and George, from the corner of his eye, monitored them like a watchman. His own composure felt like a suit of armor he was still growing into, heavy and important. Louis's freedom was a stark, confusing contrast. The royal family transferred to the Buckingham Palace balcony for the flypast, the event's grand finale. This was the iconic image, the united front. The crowd, a sea of Union Jacks and upturned, smiling faces, roared its affection. The noise was physical, a wall of sound that hit the balcony. For George, it was part of the script. He waved a small, controlled arc of his hand. For Louis, it was an exhilarating shockwave of joy. His initial shy burrow into his mother's side lasted only a moment before the spectacle of the aircraft, the roar of the typhoons, the red, white, and blue smoke of the red arrows, captured him utterly. He erupted. Hands flew to his ears, not in fear, but in dramatic, overwhelmed delight. His mouth formed a perfect O. He bounced, he jumped, he pointed skyward, his expressions shifting from awe to joy to comic shock with the purity of a cartoon. The cameras, always hungry for a new story, clicked away from the composed air and zeroed in on the charismatic spare. Each of Louis's unfiltered reactions was broadcast, magnified, and instantly adored. A meme was being born in real time, and George watched. He kept waving, his smile steady, but inside a cold, unfamiliar knot was tightening. He saw the crowd's eyes shift. He heard their laughter and coos, not for the precision of the soldiers, but for his brother's innocent chaos. He saw his parents glance down at Louis with soft, amused smiles, their attention fully consumed by the need to gently contain the little hurricane. The weight of his own posture, the careful placement of his feet, the measured pace of his wave, it all began to feel less like duty and more like foolishness. Why was he working so hard to be a statue when Louis, by simply being himself, was capturing the world? The applause for the planes faded, but the applause for Louis in the digital realm was just beginning. As the family turned to file back inside, George's eyes met Louis's. Louis, cheeks flushed with excitement, grinned a gap-toothed, triumphant grin, utterly unaware of the silent storm he had stirred in his older brother's heart. George looked away first, back straight, leading the way off the balcony as he was meant to. But The first seed of resentment, tiny and sharp, had been planted. The quiet of the palace's private quarters after the public storm felt heavy, not peaceful. While the family changed into more comfortable clothes, the outside world was already spinning Louis's antics into gold. On a tablet left on a side table, news sites flashed headlines. Prince Louis steals the show. A breath of fresh air. Beneath them, side-by-side photos said it all. One of George, dignified and still, the other of Louis, hands on ears, face a mask of glorious shock. The contrast was framed not as difference, but as competition. George, passing by, saw them. He didn't stop to look, but the images burned into his periphery. Lunch was a casual affair, but the atmosphere was layered. William and Catherine were gently debriefing Louis, not with scolding, but with the soft, exhausted laughter of parents who had dodged a potential meltdown. "You really liked the loud planes, didn't you, Lou?" Catherine said, smoothing his hair. Louis, energized by the memory, reenacted the noise, making zooming sounds with his mashed potatoes. Princess Charlotte, ever the pragmatic middle child, rolled her eyes with a sisterly affection that held no complexity. "He was so loud," she stated, but she was smiling. George pushed his food around his plate. The praise for Louis felt like a spotlight that had accidentally swung away from him, leaving him in a sudden, chilly dark. His own achievement, standing perfectly, behaving impeccably under global scrutiny, went unmentioned. It was the expected standard. Louis, by breaking every standard, had become the star. He wasn't meant to cover his ears like that in public, was he? George finally said, his voice careful, trying to sound merely observational. The table went quiet for a beat. William looked at his eldest son, seeing not just a boy, but the weight he carried. "It was very loud, George. He's only 5. He was just being himself." The words, meant to soothe, felt like a dismissal. Being himself. George thought of his own self, locked away under layers of expectation. That self wanted to run, to shout, to make faces at the helicopters too. But that self was not permitted. The afternoon was for private time, but for George, there was no peace. He retreated to his room, a space filled with models and books, a normal boy's sanctuary that was also a prince's chamber. He picked up a football, then put it down. He tried to read, but the words blurred. The quiet hum of the palace was broken by the distant, joyful shrieks of Louis playing in the garden below. Each laugh was a tiny needle. George wandered to a window overlooking the lawn. He saw Louis, now in play clothes, chasing a dog. His earlier formal were a discarded costume. He was free. George's hands, resting on the windowsill, clenched into small fists. The composure of the balcony was gone, replaced by a hot, confused anger. It wasn't fair. He had done everything right. Louis had done everything wrong, and was being celebrated for it. Later, during a family film night, the tension found its outlet. Louis, still buzzing, couldn't sit still. He narrated parts of the cartoon, bounced on the sofa, and accidentally knocked over George's drink. It was a small accident, trivial, but for George, it was the final straw. The sticky liquid spreading on the table was the physical manifestation of the chaos Louis brought. "For goodness sake, Louis!" George snapped, his voice louder and sharper than he'd intended. "Can't you just sit still and be quiet for once? You're so annoying." The room froze. Louis's face crumpled, his lower lip trembling. Catherine pulled Louis close. "George, that was unkind. It was an accident." William fixed him with a firm gaze. "Apologize to your brother, please." George looked from his father's disappointed face to his brother's wounded one. The injustice of it all choked him. He was the one constantly having to be patient, to understand, to make way. But he ruined everything today. The words burst out, raw and unplanned. "All anyone cares about is him and his silly faces. I was the one who did it properly." With that, he turned and stalked out of the room, leaving a stunned silence behind him. The perfect composure had not just cracked, it had shattered. The silence that followed George's outburst was thicker than the palace walls. He fled not to his room, but to a forgotten alcove in a long corridor, a niche with a window seat where he could be alone. The angry tears came then, hot and shaming. He wasn't crying about the spilled drink. He was crying about the spilled day, the feeling that his own hard work had been poured onto the ground and ignored. From the sitting room, he heard the low murmur of his parents' voices, then the sounds of Charlotte and Louis being taken to bed earlier than planned. The normalcy of the evening was broken, and he was the cause. About 20 minutes later, he heard a familiar, steady tread. It wasn't the quicker, lighter step of his mother, but his father's. William found him not by searching, but by knowing. He sat beside George on the window seat, not touching him, just sharing the quiet view of the darkening garden. For a long time, neither spoke. It felt unfair. William finally said, not as a prince, but as a father. It wasn't a question. George nodded, unable to trust his voice. William sighed, a sound of shared weariness. When I was your age, and Uncle Harry was Louis's age, I felt that way quite often. George glanced up, surprised. It was hard to imagine his father, the picture of calm authority, ever feeling this bubbling, hot jealousy. He was always funnier, louder, more natural in front of people. I felt like I had to be the serious one. It was lonely. He explained the constant balance, not as theory, but as memory. He spoke of duty not as a grand concept, but as a promise to their country, to history, and, most importantly, to each other as a family. Louis's job right now is very different from yours, George. His job is to be 5, to learn, to laugh, to explore, and, yes, sometimes to be a bit of a nuisance. A faint smile touched William's lips. Your job is to learn, too, but you're learning how to carry something very big. That means sometimes you have to be still when you want to run. You have to be quiet when you want to shout. It is the hardest thing to learn, and I am still learning it. He turned to look at George directly. What Louis did today, people loved because it was a moment of real, human joy. They saw a little boy, not a prince, and that is important too. But what you did, George, the stillness, the respect you showed for the soldiers, the tradition, that was also real. It was a different kind of strength. One is not better than the other. They are both parts of who we are, and this family needs both. Down the hall, Catherine was having a different but parallel conversation with Louis. In his pajamas, snuggled in his bed, Louis was confused and sad. Is Georgie cross with me? He asked. Catherine brushed his hair from his forehead. He's not cross with you, my love. He was just having a big feeling. You know how sometimes a feeling is too big for your body? Louis nodded, thinking of his own urge to jump during the fly past. George has very big feelings sometimes, and today he had to keep them very still inside for a long time. It's hard work. Your joy made everyone smile today, Lou. But we must also remember that George has an important job on days like this, and he takes it very seriously. She was building a bridge of understanding, helping the younger see the older not as a rival, but as a brother carrying a different load. Meanwhile, William's words were slowly seeping into George's heart. The different kind of strength resonated. He thought of the soldiers on parade, their absolute stillness. That was a powerful choice, not a lack of spirit. His father wasn't dismissing his feelings. He was validating them, then reframing the lens. The jealousy began to soften, not disappear, but morph into something more complicated. Perhaps the day wasn't a competition with a winner and loser. Perhaps it was a tapestry, and Louis's vibrant, chaotic threads were just as necessary as his own straight, steady ones. I shouldn't have shouted, George mumbled, his voice thick. I should apologize. William put an arm around his shoulders. You should. Not because you were wrong to feel upset, but because how we express those feelings matters. We lead with kindness, especially with our family. They are our team. For the first time that day, George's shoulders truly relaxed. The armor of composure had been heavy because he was wearing it alone. Now, he felt his father sharing the load. The next morning dawned with a fragile, new clarity. The palace routine continued. Breakfast, lessons, the gentle rhythm of their private life. But the undercurrent from the previous day had shifted. George watched Louis with less heat and more curiosity. He saw not just an annoying little brother, but a small person blissfully unaware of the intricate web of expectations that already encircled his own life. Louis, for his part, was unusually quiet around George, a tentative look in his eye. After lessons, George found Louis in the garden, attempting to dig a fort that was mostly a hole in a flower bed. A gardener looked on with patient horror. George walked over. Louis paused, his small frame tense, waiting for another telling off. Instead, George knelt down. "What are you building?" he asked, his voice neutral. Louis blinked. "A bunker. For the worms. For when the planes come back." It was the logic of a 5-year-old, sincere and absurd. A smile, genuine and unforced, touched George's lips. "The red arrows might scare them, I suppose." Louis nodded vigorously, encouraged. "They're very loud. I had to cover my ears." He demonstrated, his hands slapping against his head with a dramatic flair that was so him. George didn't feel a spike of irritation this time. He saw the memory through Louis's eyes, not as a breach of protocol, but as an overwhelming sensory experience. It was loud, George agreed. He picked up a small trowel. Maybe the bunker needs a roof. For mud protection. For the next half hour, the future king and his brother built a worm bunker. They got dirt under their nails. They argued about the best location. They laughed when a worm was found and ceremoniously placed inside. It was mundane, messy, and real. The cameras were gone. This was just them. Later, William called George into his study. On the desk was a sleek laptop. "I want to show you something," he said. He pulled up the official social media feed from Trooping the Color. There were, as expected, countless images of Louis. But William scrolled further. He stopped on a series of photos. George, standing tall beside him. George, watching the soldiers with focused respect. George, sharing a quiet word with his grandfather, the king. The captions were different. Prince George, demonstrating impressive poise. A young man growing into his role with dignity. The steadfast presence of the future. The comments were fewer than under Louis's viral photos, but they were substantive. He looked so thoughtful. You can see the weight of history in his care. What a serious, kind young man. William then opened a folder of letters, real paper letters sent to the palace. Many were for veterans and serving military personnel. That young Prince George, one old soldier had written in a shaky hand, "He stood for us." He watched with respect. You could see he understood what the day was really about. It meant the world. Another, from an army wife. "My son wants to be a soldier." He saw Prince George taking it all so seriously and said, "Mom, he knows it's important." George read them in silence, his heart swelling with a feeling far deeper than the fleeting buzz of online likes. This was connection. This was impact. His stillness had been seen, and it had resonated with people for whom the ceremony was not a spectacle, but a sacred symbol of service and sacrifice. The approval of the crowd was a weather vane, spinning with the wind. This was bedrock. William closed the laptop. The noise is always about the splash, George. But the deep water, the current that really matters, is quiet. It's about constancy. Louis makes people happy in the moment. You, by your steady presence, give people a sense of continuity, of stability. That is a profound gift. It just doesn't trend on the internet. That evening, the family was together again. The atmosphere was lighter. When Louis began fidgeting during a board game, George didn't tense. He simply reached over and, with a brotherly nudge, said, "Your turn, Lou, focus." It wasn't a reprimand. It was a reminder, delivered with a patience he hadn't felt the day before. Louis grinned and took his turn. Later, as Catherine read Louis a bedtime story, George lingered in the doorway. Louis, his eyes drooping, spotted him. "Good night, Georgie," he mumbled. "Thanks for the bunker." George nodded. "Night, Lou. No loud planes tonight." As he walked to his own room, the comparison that had tormented him felt unimportant. His path was a long, straight road, lined with duty and service. Lewis's path was a winding, exploratory trail through the woods beside it. They were different journeys, but they were in the same country. The composure he sought was not the absence of feeling, he realized, but the mastery of it. It wasn't about being a statue. It was about being an anchor, steady, reliable, unshaken by the waves, even the charming, chaotic waves made by his little brother. Weeks later, a smaller, less formal royal engagement took place. The opening of a community youth center. The family attended together. The press was there, of course, their lenses inevitably drawn to Lewis, who was excitedly trying out a pottery wheel with predictably messy results. George, however, had a separate task. William had asked him to help present an award to a group of cadets for their community service. Standing before a small, attentive audience of locals and the cadets themselves, George felt the familiar weight of expectation settle on his shoulders. He glanced at the cue card in his hand, then at the young people in uniform before him. He thought of the letters from the soldiers. He didn't just read the words. He looked up, made eye contact, and spoke clearly. "What you've done is really brilliant," he said, a slight, earnest smile breaking through his formal tone. "Thank you for your service." It was a small moment, but it was his own. The cadets beamed. A photo was taken. George, slightly taller than the cadets, shaking hands, his expression a blend of shyness and genuine respect. It wouldn't break the internet, but it would mean the world to those 6 young people. After the presentation, he rejoined his family. Lewis, now with clay smeared on his cheek, was showing Charlotte a lopsided pot. "Look what I made," he declared, holding it up like a trophy. The cameras swiveled. George watched, and instead of the old, cold knot, he felt a warm, protective fondness. He saw the crowd's delighted faces, saw how Lewis's uninhibited joy broke down barriers and made everyone feel at ease. That was Lewis's magic. It wasn't a threat to his own, it was a compliment. As Lewis turned, pot held high, he nearly tripped over his own feet. George's hand shot out, steadying him by the shoulder almost automatically. "Careful," he said, his voice low. Lewis looked up, clay and all, and grinned. The photographer captured that too. The future king, his composure intact but softened, guiding his exuberant brother. The picture told a new story, not of rivalry, but of balance. On the drive back to the palace, Lewis, exhausted from his efforts, fell asleep against the car window. Charlotte was engrossed in a book. In the quiet, Catherine turned from the front passenger seat and smiled at George. "You did wonderfully today with those cadets. You made it feel very special." William caught his eye in the rearview mirror and gave a slight, proud nod. The validation was quiet, but it landed deep. George looked out at the passing London streets, the same streets he had traveled on Trooping the Color Day. He felt different. The journey hadn't changed, but his understanding of his place in it had. That night, as he prepared for bed, he thought about the 2 photos that would likely appear in the papers tomorrow. One of Lewis, covered in clay, a symbol of joyful chaos. One of himself, steady and respectful with the cadets, a symbol of growing duty. For the first time, he didn't see them in conflict. He saw a whole picture. A family needed its heart and its backbone. A nation needed both its comforting joy and its steady promise. Lewis, with his antics, charmed everyone. And he, George, by learning to find his composure not in rigidity, but in a deeper understanding of his role and his relationships, would learn to lead them. The loss of composure in the days after trooping had been necessary. It was the breaking of shell that was too small for him. What was growing in its place was stronger, more flexible, and far more real. He was not just learning to be a king. He was learning to be a brother, a son, and a young man who could hold both duty and humanity in the same steady hands. The story was no longer about George losing composure. It was about him finding a better, truer kind of strength.